Alright, welcome to our two-part lecture series on the historical background of the modern state. These slides are designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture, and I am, of course, Ms. Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So, when we talk about how space is organized politically into states and nations, we need to go through and do a little bit of history and define some terms and things like that. We'll be doing that over the course of the lecture. The first thing we want to start with is kind of where do we come up with this modern state idea? Okay, so some history to know. First of all, the idea of the state appears in various forms across world regions starting about 400 or 500 years ago. Ultimately, it's the European state idea that most influences the development of a modern state system. Okay, and as that state system is starting to emerge, what we see is that it's accompanied by what's called mercantilism. And mercantilism is an economic theory which leads to the accumulation of wealth through a combination of plunder, colonization, and the protection of home industries in foreign markets. And those home industries and foreign markets and colonization all play hand in hand, because the idea is, in mercantilism, is that we are taking resources out of colonies, bringing them to the home industries to use, and then as the home industries turn those resources into completed products, we're shipping them back to the colonies, which now function as foreign markets, and selling them. And what this really does is twofold. One, it provides a market for export goods that are produced by the factories. And two, it provides a way, essentially what it is a huge transfer of wealth from the colonies to the home country. And it's on the backs of this mercantilist system that we see the development of modern three-tier world systems theory, core, periphery, semi-periphery, really develop. So, going back though to some of the history, most historians date the modern state system really to the Peace of Westphalia, which was negotiated in 1648. And essentially what that does, that Westphalian system is the way we call it, is that it kind of defines what is a state. And one of the key pieces that it discusses is the idea of territory, and it being the territory that defines the society or defines the state. So territory then becomes key land, okay, as a fixed element of political identification, and states define both themselves and with their neighbors exclusive non-overlapping territories. Right, so the idea is no two countries claim the same territories, and that part of that identification with the land is that political identification, so that identification with the government then that has sovereignty, has control over that land. So, that's the idea of the state. We talk about nations. Nations are culturally defined terms, or is a culturally defined term, and you can find some agreement on more or less what it means, and different people will define it in slightly different ways. Okay. In general, we use it with that kind of original definition, which is to say it refers to a group of people who think of themselves as a group of people based on that shared sense of culture and history, and who also seek some degree of political or territorial autonomy. In other words, okay, they have a common history, common culture. Culture often includes language, might include religion, but also, and this is a key piece of it, they have to want to try and control their territory. Okay? Ultimately, nations are oftentimes mixtures of different groups of people. Not always, but oftentimes. And the tricky part with nations, and this is why people disagree on what exactly it means, is that nations are defined by their own membership. That's why we can't just simply say, you know, the United States is a nation. Well, yes and no, and it depends on how people within the U.S. would then define it, right? So we can't just say people in X territory belong to Y nation, because they may not see themselves that way, and that then becomes its own series of issues. When we take those two ideas, the nation and the state, and we put them together, what we get is, obviously, we call it a nation state. but it's a politically organized space in which the nation and the state occupy the same space. So in other words, the government and the cultural group share common boundaries and borders, right? And the goal of creating nation states and what are called like pure nation states, where it's a single cultural group within a country, really dates back to about the French Revolution. And if you're not as familiar with historical dates, just know the French Revolution starts in the late 1790s and goes actively till about the 1820s, and then in fits and spurts after that. Okay, and out of that French Revolution and out of really the American Revolution, we get this idea of democracy. Democracy is anytime you see that suffix C-R-A-C-Y, talking about some type of government. The root word demo or demos is Greek. It means the people. So this is a government of the people or by the people. Okay, so it's a representative government that's elected by the people. The trick with the nation-state idea is that it assumes that you've got well-defined, stable nations that live contiguously in discrete territories. In English, right? Well-defined, stable nations, that you can kind of figure out. We've got cultural groups. They know who they are. It's very clear who they are. They aren't changing very much. Living contiguously just means next to each other. Okay? They're next to each other, but they're in discrete territories, which means that we can draw a line between groups. Okay, that's really what that means. We talk about kind of what in a perfect world the nation state looks like. You and I both know that there are very few places where we've got a single cultural group living under a government of its own choice. Okay. Generally speaking, we've got some combination of multiple cultural groups that are living under a shared government, which they may or may not completely support. So, getting back to it though, when we talk about nation states and talking about nations and things like that, one of the biggest things that countries try to do is create a sense of nationalism, right? So, and countries and groups of people who want to become countries create this loyalty to and a belief in the nation itself, right? Every morning when we come to school and we say the Pledge of Allegiance, that's an attempt to build up a strong sense of nationalism, a strong sense of loyalty or belief to the nation, right, of the United States as kind of a common cultural group. States, on the other hand, try to promote a sense of nationhood that coincides with their borders. And this is really, in a lot of ways, where the pledge more falls into. As opposed to, say, when I lived in Alaska and I was a child and we had to learn to sing the Alaska flag song, that created a sense of loyalty to Alaska. It didn't really promote a sense of loyalty to the United States itself, right? To help people within borders, back to the idea of promoting nationhood within the state, to help people within the borders relate to the dominant national ideal, governments really seek to provide a handful of things so that people believe in them, people believe they're going to do what they need to do. These are things like security, okay, security in self and security in property. They provide infrastructure. So in other words, infrastructure of things like roads, buildings, schools, electricity, basic services and things like that. They also try to make sure that there are goods and services that are not exactly evenly spread, but that people have access to those goods and services that they need. Okay, so countries will do this as a way to, again, try and reinforce belief in the country itself. So, let me go ahead and just recap a little bit. We talked about the history of nations and states, and specifically we looked a little bit at the Westphalian model, which is the model that comes out of Europe, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Okay, and the key piece you got to remember about that is that it adds territory to that list of characteristics. So in other words, territory becomes one of those defining characteristics of a state, of a country, that it's got to have marked off territory. As we see the rise of the modern state in Europe. We also see parallel with it the rise of mercantilism, which is really an early modern form of capitalism in which countries seek to exploit their colonies both by transferring resources out of them and then ultimately by selling goods back to them. And in the process, what it ends up being is a huge transfer of wealth between colony and colonizer. And it's from that transfer of wealth that we get the modern core, periphery, semi-periphery system. After we talked about those things, we went ahead and talked a little bit about definitions, talked about what is a nation and what is a state. Right? Remember, nations are cultural groups. They're self-defined. They often share some kind of a common history, some kind of a common language or religion, but definitely some kind of a shared culture. Right? And they may or may not have new borders. States, on the other hand, this is the modern country ideal. Right? And so one of the key pieces of that, we talked about land. States have governments, and those governments try to promote loyalty to the government, loyalty to the state, right? We call that nationalism. And to do that, they do things like provide security, right? So security is really a way of saying protection. Make sure that the guy down the street doesn't steal all my stuff, right? They provide infrastructure, roads, schools, electricity, water, things like that. They also make sure that goods and services get spread throughout the territory and that people have access to those things. So sometimes states literally give these things away, but a lot of times, most of the time, what they do is just make sure that they're available. And just the idea that those are available helps people to believe in the state and believe that the state will do the things it needs to do. So this has been our first in the two-part series on the historical basis for the modern state. If you have any questions, please feel free to come see me during class, and otherwise I will see you the next time we meet.